بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. نشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه، على الحبيب المصطفى خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله سبحان الله، نؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم يا علي عظيم، اللهم يا رب إنا نعوذ بك ونتوكل عليك، نعوذ بك أن نضل أو نضل أو نزل أو نزل أو أن نظلم أو نظلم أو أن نجهل أو نستجهل، ونبتهل إليك فنقول: اللهم يا نور السماوات والأرض اجعل لنا نورا يا رب العالمين. Something that caught my eye that came out very recently was an interesting study although the sample of the study is not large enough and the methodology of the study is not conclusive enough for us to build many conclusions. But the preliminary indications of the study, at least the 1,000 people sampled, pointed to some dangerous and painful facts in our lives as Muslims. In this study, people from different religions and backgrounds were sampled. In the sample were Jews, Protestants, Catholics, what the study categorized as white evangelicals, non-affiliated, and also Muslims. And the study asked people to respond to a series of questions. Are Muslims less civilized than the rest of the world? Are Muslims more prone to violence than the rest of the world? Are Muslims more dangerous to peace, stability, and security than the rest of the world? And the surprising thing is that from the sample polled, Muslims were far more likely to give responses consistent with Islamophobia than non-Muslims. So, for instance, are Muslims less civilized than the rest of the world? 5% of the Jews polled said yes. 6% of the Catholics polled said yes. 5% of the Protestants polled said yes. 7% of white evangelicals polled said yes. 5% of the non-affiliated said yes. 5% of the general public said yes. And when it came to Muslims, 19% of the Muslims polled said yes. This is consistent with what my own observations and readings indicate. In other words, this study affirms what a lot of the literature about Islamophobia already documents, that Islamophobia Islamophobia's primary impact, Islamophobia's main target, are Muslims themselves. That indeed, those influenced by Islamophobia and the propaganda of the Islamophobia industry, more than anyone else, in fact, 3 times more likely or 4 times more likely to be influenced by Islamophobia are Muslims themselves. Some years ago, I met a graduate student who was doing a study, I forget now which university, but a psychologist who planned and organized and studied with a careful methodology to get at the subconscious, the realm of unconscious consciousness, subconscious assumptions of Muslims about their own tradition and about their own religion. And subhanAllah, although I met that graduate student some 10 years ago, the conclusions of his study was very much consistent with the conclusions of this recent poll-based study, that Muslims are far more likely to be influenced by Islamophobia than non-Muslims. Now, what that means is that although Muslims, we are talking about those who are still identifying as Muslims. We're not talking about those who left the tradition altogether or who left the religion altogether. We're not talking about those who no longer self-identify as Muslims, but we are talking about people who still identify as Muslims, but yet their own view of their own identity and their own tradition suffers from a deep sense of deprecation and shame. That, in fact, there are a whole host of questions that have been raised in their mind that leave this sense of lowliness, smallness, embarrassment, or shame. The impact of Islamophobia is consistent, persistent, and undeniable. And this type of racism, and I use the word intentionally, racism, not bigotry, but racism, that this type of racism is so endemic, so widespread, so persistent, and so unchallenged. Unchallenged. In the same way that the biggest victory of Satan was to convince people that Satan doesn't exist, the biggest victory of this form of racism is to convince you that this racism doesn't exist. Is to convince you that it is a matter of intellectual disagreement that could be addressed by shedding light upon the facts and hiding the deep roots of Islamophobia in a history of racism directed at Muslims and Islam from the very beginning of this faith. From the time that Europe used to refer to all Muslims as Turks or Moors or Saracens, a camouflaged racism. The thing about anti-Semitism, racism against Jews, or racism against blacks, or racism against Asians, is that it is difficult to camouflage. It has no scapegoat to hide behind other than simply the fact of denying that it exists by saying, well, I'm not racist. But you can't deny the institution of racism against blacks, or the institution of racism against Jews, or the institution of racism against Asians, because that institution is a reality to blacks, to Asians, to Jews. But the truth of the matter is that you can deny that the institution of racism against Muslims. You can deny it by hiding into a claim of civilizational conflict or claims of religious disagreement or claims that this is a matter of interface dynamics. The most dangerous form of racism is the type of racism that goes unrecognized, unexposed. The type of racism that is directed at a people who don't realize that the hatred directed at them is indeed because of racial categories. Now, race itself is constructed category. Race is not biological. It is true that skin color invokes certain psychological responses within us that has to do with our experiences in life, and has to do with how we are brought up, and has to do with our sense of morality. Yes, skin color does that. But the same type of impulses that are provoked by skin color are also provoked by perceptions of constructed races that have nothing to do with skin color. So studies have shown, and this is numerous studies, if Muslims only bother to read, that regardless of how light-skinned or dark-skinned someone might be from North Korea or from Japan or from Asia, it is the constructed idea of race that induces an impulse within the subject, and that impulse is the same regardless of the biological facts. So when Europe described Muslims as Moors or Saracens or Turks, they constructed a race. They imagined a race. And that is what they responded to. Now, I said that the impact of Islamophobia is constant and systematic and persistent. Another story that caught my eye, and actually someone sent me this story. I didn't know about it, although Professor Sahar Aziz, who's a well-known professor at Rutgers University, a law professor, spoke about this story apparently at length. And I was surprised that I did not know about it until someone forwarded the story to me. But it is a representative story of an incident, representative of what goes on all the time, unchecked for the most part and unchallenged. A woman, Natalie Abul Hawa, a Palestinian woman who trained to become an athletic trainer and was hired by Agnes Irwin School as an athletic trainer. Natalie Abul Hawa, as a Palestinian, has been active on social media expressing her views about the plight of her people. And has tweeted or used other social media to comment upon Israeli crimes against Palestinians. After Natalie was hired by the Agnes Irwin School, someone discovered tweets that were 10 years old in which Agnes expresses her intense dislike for what Israel stands for and what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And as a result, Agnes was fired after 2 weeks of her hire from that school. And the thing, of course, is that after that, despite her many efforts to find other employment, Islamophobic organizations like the Canary Project and like Campus Watch would consistently intervene with every employer to deny her a job. And as far as I know, Natalie Abul Hawa remains unemployed because Islamophobic organizations have targeted her and have slandered her and maligned her, and she remains untouchable. But persistent studies show that as much as 50% of Muslim children experience some form of Islamophobic discrimination before they reach the age of 18. As high as 70% of adult Muslims report that they've experienced some incident in which of hatred against Islam or against Muslims. So, okay. If hatred and bigotry and racism against Muslims is so widespread, what explains the defeatist, broken attitude of some Muslims in responding to what is clearly a crisis situation directed at their faith? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah At-Tawbah that if your parents or your siblings or your wives or your husbands or your children or your money or your property is more beloved to you than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet, and preoccupies you more than a jihad struggling in the path of Allah, and Allah promises you in Surah At-Tawbah that if this is the case, then indeed your fate will be degradation and lowliness and humiliation. Allah promises us that, warns us about that. Is this the problem? Is the problem that at the individual level, at the micro level, for each individual Muslim, when a Muslim is confronted by the challenge of an ugly reality, instead of committing themselves to being a soldier in a war against an ugly reality, they become preoccupied with their professional career. They become preoccupied with their love story, who they're married to, or who they're going to be married to, or who they're not married to, or who they divorced, or become preoccupied with the best interests of their own personal family, their mother, their father, their brother, their sister, their children, or indeed become preoccupied with their national identity and forget the Islamic part altogether. I am Saudi, and I'm mainly about being Saudi. Or I am Egyptian, and I'm mainly about being Egyptian. Well, look, when there is a complicated illness and we see persistent sign of the ailment and the disease, if we are people of hikmah, if we are people of any level of wisdom, we must look deeply and analyze the nature of this disease. You cannot separate the reality of the impact of Islamophobia upon our consciousness and the way that it contributes Muslims to do precisely what Surah At-Tawbah warned them about, to become selfish and insular and self-centered. Let me give you an example of what I mean in concrete terms. This year, or the past year, the year just passed, registered the highest number of American Jews migrating to Israel to join the new settlements, grabbing Palestinian lands and territories. The highest in recorded history. You read a story just recently. The Israeli Supreme Court ruled against 1,200 Palestinians in the area of Masafer Yatta. With this ruling of the Israeli Supreme Court, 1,200 Palestinians will lose their land. Their homes will be demolished. And that territory, their villages, their homes, their lands, will all be confiscated by the Israeli military. Now, this follows persistent, antagonistic, aggressive initiatives by Israeli settlers in which young Zionists come mostly from European countries and the United States and dedicate and commit themselves to the colonial goal of robbing Palestinian territory. This news is so persistent, and the actions of these young energetic, aggressive, immoral Israeli settlers is so common that it hardly raises an eyebrow anymore. On the one hand, you've got people committed to the destruction of the Islamic faith, spending millions and billions of dollars to destroy the Islamic faith, spending millions and billions of dollars to help anyone and support anyone that says, I am part of the war against Islam and Muslims. You've got young kids who commit and dedicate themselves to the goal of the complete annexation of all of historical Palestine and the eviction of Palestinians completely away from this land. And they are willing to sacrifice careers and relations with loved ones and proximity to loved ones and love stories and whatever else to achieve this ideological goal. On the other side, you have a deep sense of alienation, embarrassment, insularity, and inaction. On the Muslim side, very little is going on to respond to Islamophobia. In fact, what is going on is that largely Muslims suffering from a sense of defeatism retreat back to precisely what Allah warned us about in Surah At-Tawbah. Retreat back to taking care of their family, taking care of mom and dad, taking care of their children, taking care of their love life, taking care of who they want to marry or who they're married to or who divorced them or who didn't divorce them. Their life is about themselves and very little else. And they philosophize that. By saying, well, didn't Allah say to take care of your parents? Didn't Allah say to take care of your children? Didn't Allah say that you have a duty to your family? I will comment on what this is exactly in a second. But first, we must shed a lens of enlightenment upon this defeatism, this brokenness, this lowliness. Why a people who once, as in Surah At-Tawbah, which was revealed on the occasion of Ghazwat Taboo, why the people who once challenged Roman hegemony and stood proudly. It is remarkable that Allah's revelation comes in Surah At-Tawbah, because the Battle of Taboo itself was after Muslims conquered Mecca and after Muslims conquered Khaybar, all of Arabia said to the world, the Muslims are here. The news started reaching the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire that there is a new kid on the block, and this kid is not willing to be pushed around anymore. Those people of the desert that have been subjugated, obediently humiliated, and bossed around for centuries by the Persian Empire, by the Byzantine Empire, are saying, we are proud Muslims and we will be subjugated to no one. And the news, the message reached the Byzantines loud and clear. Why did it reach the Byzantines loud and clear? Because there were tribes that for centuries had been paying jizya to the Byzantine Empire. And after Ghazwat Khaybar, they pledged allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ and informed the Byzantines, we are no longer going to pay the jizya. The Byzantines got the point, and they thought, we must nip this in the bud. How can these people who have been subjugated by us for centuries dare to stand up and to start talking about the right to determine their own fate? And so the Prophet ﷺ and his companions learned that the Byzantine Empire was preparing a huge army to invade the newly constituted Muslim state in Arabia. And classic, typical of what the Prophet taught about honor and pride, the Prophet turned to his companions and said, shall we wait until we are invaded? By God, we will not. And we will intercept the Byzantine Empire and challenge it before they even had an opportunity to cross into our borders. And this is how the Battle of Taboo came about. And this is the context in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Muslims, what's your priority? Are you just about your family, your relationships, your career, your profession, your money? Or are you about jihad? A cause, a purpose, a commitment, a sacrifice, a dedication. But yet, I come back. How is dedication possible when you are dealing with a broken people? With people who do not even have enough confidence in their own religion or their own faith. Ghazwat Tabuk itself is a very good example. Very good example. There are two narratives about Ghazwat Tabuk. Like so much of Islamic history, like so much of all history of all people, whether it's Christian history, Jewish history, Hindu history, Buddhist history, There is a version about Ghazwat Tabuk that Islamophobes love, and a version about Ghazwat Tabuk that Islamophobes don't love. And the version that Islamophobes love is that the reason for Ghazwat Tabuk, or the Battle of Tabuk, is that after the Prophet dominated all of Arabia, the Prophet said, now it's time to make a move against Christians and Jews and subjugate them. And that version is reported in Ibn Kathir. That Tabuk was not about a strike against an aggression by Byzantine forces. That Tabuk was in fact an act of aggression by Muslims against Christians. But Ibn Kathir also reports the other version, that Muslims, the Arabs rather, people of this region, have been dominated and degraded and mistreated by the Byzantines for centuries. And they looked at Muslims as liberators. And they rushed to join Muslims because Muslims promised them a sense of dignity and honor. For the first time, they would stand up to a superpower that has been degrading them for centuries. But you see, this is precisely the point. The version reported by Ibn Kathir that Islamophobes don't like, it's not the version on Sheikh Google. If you Google Tabuk, you will find the version that Islamophobes do like. If you look at most books available in the market in the West and in Europe, you'll find the version that Islamophobes like. Muslims don't control their history. They don't control their narrative. So they don't control their sense of dignity. If you don't control your narrative, then your claims of dignity are false and unreal. How can a people who are talked about, invented and constructed by the other, avoid a sense of brokenness? How can a people who do not control their own narrative about their own identity avoid being the primary victims of Islamophobia? Sure, most Muslims have no clue. They read the version preferred by Islamophobes, and they read that it's an Ibn Kathir, and that's all they know. And what results from that is doubt. Doubt, sense of humiliation and brokenness. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. اسألوا الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. what adds to the sense of brokenness, the sense of this is all bad news. This is all so depressing. Because it's so depressing, I'm going to focus on my career. I'm going to focus on my parents. I'm going to focus on my children. I'm going to focus on my marriage. I'm going to focus on whatever I focus on, but I'm not going to focus on jihad. Yeah, it is. Let me again give you an example. When you read last khutbah, we talked about a poor woman who was sentenced to over 30 years in prison for tweets. As if the misery from Muslim lands can never come to a stop. As if Allah has cursed us to some hellish nightmare that we cannot come out of. The former Imam of Mecca's Grand Mosque, the Imam that led prayer in the Haram for years, that gave khutbahs in the Haram for years, is sentenced to 10 years in prison. Why? Because he made critical comments about the parties thrown by the Saudi government and about segregation of sexes. And for that, he's sentenced to 10 years in prison. Another story from the custodian of the two holy sites. An Egyptian doctor working in Saudi Arabia had a disagreement with the Ministry of Health. He was employed by the Ministry of Health, and he had a disagreement with the Ministry of Health about his contract. So he sued the Ministry of Health and won his lawsuit. And immediately after he won his lawsuit, he was arrested. What was he charged with? Some other inmate, the Saudi government produced another inmate who claimed to know this Egyptian doctor, Sabri Shalabi, and said that Sabri Shalabi voted in Egyptian elections for the Ikhwan. That's all the evidence that was against him. Sabri Shalabi said, I never voted in Egyptian elections because when the elections were held, I wasn't in Egypt. And I never saw this guy who the Saudi government produced to testify against me. And this entire thing is just because I won a lawsuit against the Ministry of Health. Did any of this matter? No. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison in Saudi Arabia. I could go on and on. But another Imam, this time in Israel, Sheikh Yusuf al-Baz, arrested under administrative detention. And administrative detention in Israel, no evidence is needed. The government can do it at will. And you're held for 6 months, renewable indefinitely. The Israeli government can keep renewing the 6 months detention without any evidence for 20 years, 30 years. And the Israeli Supreme Court said it's all constitutional. And the Israeli Supreme Court said there is no violation of human rights. And this is not inconsistent with the presumption of innocence. And the Imam Yusuf al-Baz, who's a prominent Palestinian clergy, with zero attention by human rights groups or Muslims, is perishing in prison. As yet another Palestinian, Khalil Uwaida, has been on a hunger strike because of consistent administrative detentions, in which he had spent all his life in prison on no evidence. So he went on a hunger strike for 4 months, and he is about to die, and his family is appealing to the world, and complete silence. What is my point? My point is the sheer amount of injustice and ugliness. Coupled with that, another part of what Muslims must confront and contend with. Despite the assassination of Khashoggi, despite what Biden said about Saudi Arabia being a pariah state, a detailed article documents how various interests, think tanks, political bodies, entertainment interests, all types of organizations in the West are now accepting Saudi money a golfer called, I have nothing about golf, but this struck me as rather interesting. A golfer called Mickelson was paid $138 million in 1 year. $138 million in 1 year to play golf sponsored by the Saudi government. According to this study, I'm going to skip all the money that Saudi has been spending on think tanks and various political organizations. But Saudi Arabia had spent, according to the Department of Education records, $2.6 billion on academic institutions in the United States and the West. Why do you think Saudi Arabia is spending $2.6 million on academic institutions in the West? Sponsoring chairs, sponsoring departments. 17 million just recently went to MIT. Other than, of course, the money that Saudi gives to places like Harvard and many other institutions. And Princeton, where they sponsor the chair. Do you think this money comes without strings attached? All of this money is not to defend the rights of the poor Egyptian doctor who had his life destroyed for winning a lawsuit. Is not to liberate the poor Palestinian imam who is perishing in administrative detention. It is definitely not to help the other poor Palestinian on a hunger strike. It is not even to respond to, at any level, to Islamophobia or to enlighten people about Ghazwat Taboo or any other aspect. All of this money, all of the money that goes to academics who occupy chairs, to departments, to research institutions. In fact, according to this article, Celebrities will now make more money pitching a foreign government than making a film these days. Saudi Arabia is showering millions of dollars on celebrities just so the name of the celebrity can be associated with the Saudi government. The Emirati government is doing the same. The Qatari government is doing the same. All of this money is not to defend Allah, not to defend the Prophet, not to defend the two sacred sites, not to defend Mecca and Medina, not to be the custodian of the holy sites. All of this money is to prop up a dictator. Prop up a dictator. All of this money spent by Egypt, for instance, to defend the reputation of the Egyptian government is to prop up a dictator, one person. All of the money that Emirat spends is to prop up a dictator. All of the money that Saudi Arabia spends is to prop up a dictator. Surah At-Tawbah takes us then, after telling us, ask yourself, what's your life about? Is it about your love life? Is it about your career? Is it about taking care of your parents? Is it about taking care of your children? And Allah promising you lowliness and degradation and humiliation if your choices are not the right choices. Allah then takes us in the same surah to those who came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, you know, we can't join the jihad because if we join the jihad, we fear fitna. And Allah comments on this and says, أَلَا فِي الْفِتْنَةِ سَقَطُوا. They think that by spending their time, wasting their time on social media, wasting their time thinking about themselves, thinking about their selfish goals, being self-centered, selfish egoists. They think that they are avoiding fitna. In other words, that somehow they're convincing themselves we are being good Muslims. And Allah comments and says, yeah, you could kid yourself, you could lie to yourself, but you can't lie to Allah. أَلَا فِي الْفِتْنَةِ سَقَطُوا. In fact, the reality is they've caused their own defeat. They've broken their own spirit. They've humiliated themselves because they chose to humiliate themselves. They chose this path. Whatever excuses they've cited, whatever justifications they've noted, Allah sees all through all of them. They're liars. They lie to themselves all the time. And they lie to Allah. وَأَلَا فِي الْفِتْنَةِ سَقَطُوا. So of course, someone sitting there will say, okay, So you've told us that our enemies are very active, committed, ideological. They tell us forget about jihad, but they are engaged in jihad night and day. The money that funds Islamophobia is their jihad. And you've told us what helps break our spirits is that every time we look at our fellow Muslims, we see our fellow Muslims wasting millions and billions of dollars prompting and promoting dictators and supporting injustice and committing ugliness. This is why Islamophobia has nestled deep into our hearts. So what do you want from us? What I want from you is to witness truthfully to Allah and be the first of Muslims. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if Saudi Arabia is an institution of ugliness and injustice night and day. What I want from you is to know where you take your Islam from. When I see that the institutions that the Emirat funds and that Saudi Arabia funds are still teaching Muslims their Islam, and that Muslims blissfully know that this person is sponsored by a Saudi chair and this person receives Emirati funds, and they are not bothered by it at all, and it doesn't affect their commitments and their choices. What I want from you is to have a sense of hikmah, wisdom, to have a sense of truth, to say, Allah, help me. Help me be sincere and true. Help me escape from the fitna. Help me not fall prey to the dictators of the world, the tyrants of the world, the exploiters of the world, the liars of the world. What I want from you is to say, Allah, you come first. Not my career, not my profession, not my parents, not my children, not my love life, not my wife, not my husband. And to say, Allah, in truth, in honesty, in sincerity, inspire me to the path to make a change, to make any change, even if minor, even if a small impact, to fight Islamophobia, so that when I meet you, I will say maybe the entire world went the path of Satan, but I remained on your path. I remained on your path. That is what I want from you. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم إني داع فأمنوا. اللهم اغفر لنا. اللهم ارحمنا. اللهم اهدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا. وانصر الإسلام وعز المسلمين يا رب العالمين. Allah forgive our sins. Allah bless us with insight and wisdom and light, and help direct us to the true path, the straight path, the honest path. Help us be vigilant, not hypocrites, not liars, not frauds, but true Muslims, committed to you, Ya Allah, Ya Ali Azim. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وتوب إحسان إلى يوم الدين وأقم الصلاة